Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's event. This is a public event as part of the European School of Literature, Literary Translation 2021. My name is and very pleased to have been asked to chair this conversation about diversifying literary translation. We have three brilliant speakers whom I will introduce you to in just a moment. We're going to have a chat about the kind of huge span of this subject for a while, but we will of course leave plenty of time for you to make comments and ask questions in the latter part of this event. So while you're listening to them speaking, do put questions in the Q&A function. There is a Q&A function which should be at the bottom of your screen, and we'll keep an eye on that, and we'll take your questions and your contributions to the conversation in the latter part of this conversation. Just brief introductions to our brilliant and distinguished and lovely panel. Skeptical. Well, the proof will be to come. We'll see. Brief introductions. BJ Epstein, who is a translator from Swedish. She's a senior lecturer at UEA, working on translation studies, on children's literature, on LGBTQ studies and literature, among other things. A recent translation of Sarah Lindberg's The Bird Within Me was recently shortlisted for the Kate Greenaway Medal, which is, I mean, it's an extraordinary book, a very beautiful, moving book, and an amazing honor to have reached that point in a prize that does not often recognize children's books in translation, which may be something I will grumble about at some further point in this conversation. Canan Marasligil is a translator, writer, cultural programmer, a curator, currently based in Amsterdam. Canan lives and works between Turkish, French, English, and Dutch. I don't know whether between is the right word. I vaguely have a sense that you are sort of simultaneously living in all of those places somehow.
I agree.
Canan is in all of those places and all of those languages all of the time, which is an interesting and complicated place to be, which I'm sure we will talk about. And Gitanjali Patel, who is a translator from Portuguese. She's a social researcher, and she's co-founder and director of Shadow Heroes, which is a brilliant organization about which you will be hearing over the course of our hour. And I think those of you who are part of the European School of Literature Translation will have already heard Gitanjali talking a little bit about this. The subject, diversifying literary translation, as you will gather from the title, is a very big and a very vague one in some senses. And I'm keen not to try and limit it, not to define it in too limited a way, because I think the breadth of the subject is sort of important, and the way all the different components of that subject connect to each other is important. And those of you who are watching in different countries and different cultures and different languages will also have different contexts for this conversation we're having. But very briefly and very broadly, we're talking, I think, about how we challenge and or how we mitigate imbalances in literary translation, inequities in literary translation, which is a question of who gets to be a translator. In part, in the UK, the profession is very majority white, very majority middle class, and so forth. There are privileges that allow access to language learning that we can talk about. There are biases about what I think we mostly call L2 translation, which we should talk about. And there are huge imbalances in what gets translated and who gets translated. Gender biases, generic biases. BJ, as I mentioned, works in children's books, as do I, which is very underrepresented, theatre as well, short fiction rather than non-fiction, and so forth. And there is a huge imbalance in language representation as well. In the UK particularly, we have incredibly little translated from South Asia, from China, from Africa, from indigenous languages in lots of places, and so forth. So there are lots of different axes in which there are imbalances that I want to talk about, and some partly how they connect with each other. But I want to start by asking you all a sort of generic question, and I suppose a biographical question, if you like. If we're talking about diversifying literary translation, we're also talking about access to this profession. And I wonder if you could each just say, by way of introduction briefly, something about what are the circumstances that led to you being in this profession, in this sector, in this this conversation in which we find ourselves in today. BJ, will you will you start on that one?
Sure. Thanks so much, Danny. So I fell into translation by accident. I was really interested in languages, and I had studied Spanish and Latin when I was growing up in America. Then I met somebody Swedish and quite randomly decided to move to Sweden, a place I'd never visited before, and I didn't speak Swedish. And so I moved there and found myself learning Swedish and began, as many people from the US or the UK do in Sweden, teaching English classes as a way of making money. And what happened is that somebody said to me, hey, you've got English as your native language. Could you just translate my website for me to Swedish? So I went, yeah, sure, no problem. So I did that. And then that person recommended me to someone else, and I started making small bits of money. And I found that I really liked translation, but I was not supporting myself as a translator. I had to do it kind of alongside my proper job, as it were, teaching. So it was definitely, you were talking about access. And for me, it was a case of I can do this in my spare time because I have the time and I have a job that's paying me, and basically that's how I got into translation. And I just found that I really loved it. But I still am not one of the lucky people who's been able to turn it into my full-time gig.
Be careful what you wish for, is all I can say. As one of the people who is reasonably close to that. That question of money is important, and I'll make sure we'll come back to that later in the conversation. I think in terms of access, but also in terms of how we value what we value as a culture. I mean, I think that's incredibly revealing. Canan, tell us about your
I think many people who grew up in multilingual families, children of migrants especially, will recognize this. I've always translated since since I started to learn to speak. So throughout my life, I translated. So for me, it was always normal to live between languages. And then as I grew up, I started to see my cultures, because Turkey is very complex, and I don't only have Turkey as a culture, but let's take Turkey as a beginning point. Growing up in Brussels, I've always seen it misrepresented everywhere. And I always wanted to tell another story of Turkey and how my family lives and what it means to me to be a Muslim, for instance. And through that, I started looking for literature, and I realized there was a lot of very rich literatures being written in Turkey, which weren't translated into French. My first translation work was from Turkish to French, and then I moved to English later. The more I continued working on Turkish contemporary literature. So it's really started from that urge for me. So I started translating text, proposing it to publishers who were absolutely not interested, saying there's no market for this. But, I pushed my way into this. And then English really welcomed me. The English language really welcomed me. The community I found through work I've done, for instance, at the Free Word Center, but also with many, many other people who are like-minded in the UK. English opened lots of doors for me. And maybe many people may think, oh, that's weird because it closes doors on me. I don't think it's an easy market either, the UK market, but this is a bit my story. So it's an urgency for me.
It's really interesting also, given what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about, who is translating, and that's partly about questions of identity, among other things. And I was interested, John, that one of the first things you said was people who are migrants and children of migrants will understand this, because the extent to which one answers this question with reference to one's own identity or one's own self-identification, how that is either a motivating impulse or an inhibiting factor somehow, I think is interesting and very relevant to what we're going to talk about. Gitanjali, tell us about your way in.
Thanks. Actually, BJ and Canan, your stories resonate very much with me in different ways. I would agree with Canan that my upbringing was in a similar sort of space, multilingual families, translating being just an everyday part of our family life. And similar to BJ, the first time I translated was because I was teaching English in Brazil, and one of my students was like, will you translate an extract from my novel? But I think translating fiction has always been a hobby, or something that I've sort of done as an activity for pleasure, because you know, as BJ said, this wasn't something that I was going to be able to pursue as my main job. And I have been working in, so for charities and for social research, and translation has formed such a big part of that, especially work in Brazil. And I think that my experience of translating in those contexts, so, you know, translating, and that would be sort of translating a whole research proposal for, that would be in terms of how I can make people understand what I'm trying to research, how my interviews are being communicated, how I'm translating them back into my research. All of those were sort of delicate processes that made me realize that translation and its relationship with power and the politics of representation are things that I feel really passionately about. And those experiences were the ones that formed what I wanted to do with Shadow Heroes, which is an initiative that I run, and we run workshops at schools that specifically look at translation as a way of teaching critical thinking. And I suppose the final part, or the thing that I'm now about to do, is alongside Shadow Heroes, I'm starting a PhD in translation, looking at translation as a critical pedagogy. So taking that a step further and researching that. And so that's sort of where I come to translation from. I'm interested in its potential to I suppose, inform young people in particular, but also practitioners, because I work with translators as part of Shadow Heroes, about contemporary power structures as a way of sort of increasing our ability to reflect on ourselves and our position in the world, and also using translation as a prism through which we can sort of examine the world. So that's sort of where my interest and sort of access to translation came from.
Thank you, Tancha. That's really interesting. And I'll come back to some of the things you were talking about, in particular, how Shadow Heroes works a little bit later in our conversation. I want to take as the starting point for this bit of our chat. I think we probably agree, relative homogeneity of the profession itself, people who are being published as literary translators. I'm speaking mostly for the UK and the rest of the English-speaking world, but this is true largely in Europe as well. The question of who translators are, or to put it another way, who has the opportunity to be a translator, how people get work when there isn't very much work to go around, and various other kind of limitations to access and from systemic biases of various kinds. I wonder, Gitanjali, whether one of the starting points for this conversation should be how we question what the default is. So how aware we are and how much we think about what the kind of existing dominant thing is that we want to be challenging.
So my experience of sort of language, assumptions about language, or what language is, and therefore, as a result, what translation is, and it has come from these sort of has come from the sort of colonial underpinnings of the modern languages discipline, especially if we're thinking about in the UK context, where the discipline was established so that the UK could train its subjects to communicate with other Western colonial powers. And so the idea around language, or teaching languages, was this tool for communication. And I think that what languages were deemed useful was sort of framed in that sense, but also in terms of thinking about language, about English itself, and what counted as English. So what counted as sort of native English speakers were usually white, wealthy people from England, and other white people were said to speak dialects. And so we get these sort of hierarchies that have been established from a really long time ago and continue to be perpetuated by our education system. And I think that, you know, when we think about languages and language learning, it's usually based on a foundation of monolingualism. So we're thinking about like how, you know, this supposed, you know, language student, they're assumed to have no other language apart from English, and that they're learning another language to add on to their English, without thinking about, you know, the fact that, you know, monolingualism is sort of a construct and how we all have this innate ability to code switch. Also, the fact that, you know, young people in the UK, it's very unlikely that they have just, you know, one language for this reason, but also that there are 300 languages spoken in UK schools today. And so we get this sort of, I suppose we're thinking about like what the foundations are and these foundational ideas, because those really sort of permeate the industry as well. These ideas of, you know, what English, who's English, what English is appropriate, the value placed on like that type of English, what languages are valuable, how ideas are shaped around, you know, it's, you know, having studied languages in this country, like I see all of those kind of tropes being taught from school to university, and then the industry is just a reflection of those ideas as well, I think, in a lot of ways.
Thank you. Janan, when you were listening to that, I was thinking about you as someone who has not only has several languages in your life all the time, but works in several different directions. And I wonder how you feel about those questions of, I suppose, how different languages get privileged and how particular relationships to a language get privileged by this industry. So I mentioned at the very beginning questions of, you know, how we value or undervalue L2 translators, for example. Mm-hmm. But it seems to me that you're in a really good position to talk about that sort of perception of several languages in which you have complicated relationships.
Exactly. Well, that's one thing I completely recognize myself, because languages, there are many layers to languages, right? It's not only, it's very emotional. Some languages are emotional. Some languages you use because you need to be part of society, and you need to do administrative things, for instance. So you have a different relationship with that language. But then when your emotional language is the one that is rejected by the society you live in, then you are in constant struggle. So in my case, Turkish is one of my emotional languages. French has become one. English now is also a language I have lots of emotions in. Dutch, for instance, is not really. I mean, I speak excellent Dutch. I was at the panel on Monday about diversifying literary translation in the Netherlands, and I did it all in Dutch, but my connection was so really not emotional. It was an extra effort. And I wouldn't have done it a few years ago, because I would have felt, oh, people are going to judge my level of Dutch and they're going to think I'm not good enough to talk about this topic. Thankfully, I got through that, you know, imposter syndrome thing, because I think this is really a construct and a way of silencing lots of people. I don't believe in this imposter syndrome anymore. It's really something that comes from outside. It has nothing to do with my own capacities. Thankfully, I got rid of it. So I thought, I'm going to go on that panel. And even if some people are going to not like my accent, especially very traditional, conservative people who think, you know, conservative way about language and how you should master a language, whatever that means. And we can also discuss about that. So I broke that barrier that maybe many people may still have, to show that it is okay. We can talk about certain subjects on a deeper level without having that emotional connection, without being born into it. And you shouldn't silence me because I don't have the same exact level as you. And this is a thing that I've been learning throughout mixing languages, moving from one language to another, and also translating, for instance. people usually ask which languages you translate from into. And I think that's the wrong question. I think we should ask, what do you translate? Because I don't translate all sorts of material from all these languages. You know, I would be incapable to translate poetry into Turkish, for instance, because I don't have that nuances in Turkish to write poetry. But I can perfectly do it in French and English. I couldn't do it in Dutch. Comics I can do in different languages, and it depends on what kind of comics. If I translate an essay, so ask me what do I translate, and then I can tell you the complexities. And also, more and more, you know, I turn to work that is multilingual. I really believe in multilingualism because everybody is multilingual, even if they think they're monolingual. And this is what I explore through projects outside of the book. And this is also, again, all these complexities with my languages come in, because I see all these languages always everywhere, especially those underrepresented in mainstream culture. They are in the streets. Those languages exist. So how come they are not better represented in our culture, whether it's on TV or literature? Yeah, and so this is a bit all my complexities. I learned to and sometimes it wasn't always, you know, it didn't always help to be multilingual because I was always, doors were closed on me, saying you are not a native speaker of French, for instance, so you cannot write or you cannot translate. So it wasn't always easy to break that barrier. And now I'm like, no, it has nothing to do with being native speaker. Languages are in movement. We always, you know, I studied Spanish at university. I used to write essays. If you ask me now to write an essay, I'll be incapable because I haven't practiced in 15 years. So this is something that moves. If you don't work on your language, you lose it. And it's the same for your native language as well.
I think that's
so interesting. I wonder. Sorry, G, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was actually just going to say to Chanan that changeability is so important to acknowledge as part of the experience of languages and being multilingual. That, you know, sometimes, you know, your Portuguese is good, sometimes your Gujarati is really good, sometimes your English is like really going down because you haven't really, you know, been speaking in certain ways. And I find that as well, like, you know, I've been doing loads of panels. I was like, oh, suddenly I'm using all of these words because I like wrote down my presentations and things like that. And it's like, sometimes you're not doing it. You know, these things, like, it's always in flux. And like that I think that's such an important point about how that kind of reflects back to the idea of like a native speaker, because what, you know, that native speaker also comes back to this like foundation of monolingualism, this idea that, you know, you start with where you start with, and then you're adding, because, you know, I don't know where I would sit in that, because I didn't speak English till I was 3. Then so am I a native English speaker? My Gujarati is like kind of crap at the moment. So it's you know, it's very, it doesn't work.
Do you have a sense? I mean, I wonder, BJ, in the university, when you're dealing with students, as you have been doing for several years at UEA, do you have a sense of there being a change in this conversation that the students are having, or that are having, you know, at the point of which students come to do a translation program, not just in terms of, you know, different languages being represented, but the way people talk about their language and these complexities that both Canan and Gitanjali have talked about in terms of how you relate maybe to different languages, rather than, as I assume, an assumption quite a long time ago, that you have lots of English language English people from England who did a modern foreign languages degree somewhere, and then picked up one of 3 big languages and came to study translation. Has that changed? Can you see a change?
I kind of wish I could just say, yes, I've seen a change, but I think my honest answer is that I haven't really seen a change. I mean, my colleague Duncan is obviously here and organized this, so he might disagree with me, but over the years, I still feel that it is mostly British students who have, exactly as you said, you know, they did a first degree in one of the big languages and decided they wanted to go on with it, continue on with it. And it is what you were talking about before, about privilege, and, you know, that they have the money money, that they can pay for this degree, and that they think, oh, look, I'm English speaking. Everybody wants books, translated to English. So I'll find somebody who's, a book in Italian or German or Spanish or French, and I'll translate it. And, the kind of work that you've been talking about with the Shadow Heroes sounds amazing. And I feel like that's needed because as part of my job at UEA, I've done a lot of talks at primary and secondary schools. And Gitanjali was talking about, I think that there are 300 languages spoken in schools. And I've talked to so many people who have a different native language or a second home language, and they've never realized that that's worthy, that's valuable, that they could do something with that as a career. And I've only been doing those talks for 10 years or something. So I haven't really seen that translates, so to speak, into a change in students coming to the university, but I would like to in the future. So I'm not really seeing the diversity yet that I'd like to.
Are you seeing any changes? And this may be a difficult question to answer, but do you feel like you're seeing changes to the kind of access people have to the profession then? Because not all of, but many of the people who come through a master's program are going to have an end goal, which is, I want to be published, I want to do this for money and so forth. Do you feel like there are some changes in those kind of points of access that people have to the profession? Or is that hard to?
Well, no, I think, some of the stuff that, for example, you've been involved in, Danny, with, the mentorship programs, I think that has helped people. I mean, when I first started at UEA, in the first week, I meet the students and I ask them, why have you come to this program? What are you hoping to do? And the number of students who said, my dream is to support myself translating poetry. And I'd say very politely, that's lovely. I hope that happens for you. Yeah. But it's not so likely that that's going to happen. But I do think that we are seeing, additional support, such as the mentorship programs, encouraging people to get their work published and to make those kinds of contacts. But maybe not as much change as we'd like to see at this stage.
That I suspect will be the answer to a lot of questions. Some change, but not as much as we want. Jana.
Yeah.
Yes, I want to add to this because one of the ways for me to look at diversifying is not only in terms of diverse pool of translators, but also diversifying what we translate and what we call literature. Because what I've been doing in the past few years, more and more, I've moved a lot outside of the book, doing literature outside of the book, working with festivals. And there's so much happening, so much excellent writing also happening for the screen, for the stage, and also requires the skills of literary translators. And when you talk about poetry, there's so much spoken word, for instance, happening that requires proper translation for lots of festivals and events and other kinds of products, if we can call them. And I think there is a need for more translators and who understand, how literature, who understand fiction and storytelling. So this is a very specific skill you cannot find in classic interpreters.
Can I just, that's a nice connection to, I think I wanted to talk about, Janan. I'm grateful for you obligingly doing my job for me. That's very helpful. Because I want to talk about exactly that question of not only, how we translate different things, not just keep translating the same variations on the same 5 books, or indeed just books, but how those things are connected. Who is the translating and what is being translated? Because what you're describing, Janan, is you as an individual with particular identity and taste and ethics and all kind of things making those decisions. And I think that connection between who is translating and what's being translated is a fascinating one and a really important one, because actually I think that the conversation about diversifying who is in the profession is, of course, about fairness and about access and about social justice and about all kinds of things. But I think one of the arguments for it is also it's how we get different voices in. It's about to use that word, the product at the end. And I don't know. I mean, maybe Gitanjali, maybe I'll ask you this first. Whether you feel like there is a helpful line we can draw between who is translating or who we want to be translating, and what are the things that are not being translated and how we get them. I mean, it's a thing that, as you'll know, I've talked about this before, that there have been a lot of initiatives in the UK and elsewhere thinking about how to diversify the profession in the UK, sort of as a way of engineering what's being published. So we want people with home languages, community languages, different relationships to the languages, in order to have more books being published that are not just translated from French and Spanish. And I wonder, Gitanjali, whether you feel that that connection between who is translating and therefore what might be the things that get translated, who might be the voices that get translated, might be a useful one.
I think that it's maybe too easy to say that, just, if that yes, there is a homogenous group at, like, in the industry, both in terms of translators, but also publishers, and therefore, certain books make it, that is definitely true. But I think to say that, it's always about the who, doesn't acknowledge the fact that, we are all sort of, we all exist with like coloniality inside of us. And so that even sometimes just sort of, I think that you can't always expect that the who will translate into what is getting translated. And it's just about an awareness of how those structures, how they make us read and interpret, and how they make us what they make us look for, and how, and what our starting point is. And I think that, if I think about, if we located in the UK or the Anglophone world, and we're looking to get more South Asian literature into the UK market, I think that, like, British Asians just as can choose the sort of can choose the books that are super foreign, like sound really foreign, or like play up to stereotypes as well. Maybe not as much, but it happens. And I think that, Kavita Banot has done really great work in sort of thinking about that. But I just think that, focusing on the who sometimes just is distracting. It is really important to think about how and why, the translation industry is so homogenous, and why. But I think that why is the thing that we need to focus on first, before we sort of think about focusing on the who. Sometimes those structures just are upheld, and and it's because there's so few spaces for minoritized translators, that there's so much pressure in those spaces to be able to fit the mold that we're told that we're meant to fit. And that's also that's related to the structures as well. So I think that by starting talking about the who is missing a step, but in short.
That's really interesting. I'm curious to know, I mean, if we kind of turn this back to front, if you like, and look at I suppose the symptoms as we see them in what gets published. I mean, I wonder, maybe BJ with Swedish, whether you have a sense of there being, within this one language, in the English-speaking market, certain kind of books are more welcome, certain kind of books are more expected, certain things that are happening, because Swedish publishing is enormous and varied and interesting, and a very small proportion of that comes into English. And I wonder if it seems reasonably obvious to you, what are the parameters that allow certain things to find their way through rather than others? We're thinking about what are the things that, who are the Swedish writers who are being heard, what are the kinds of books, and who are the people who make them? Is that clear?
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably is too obvious for me to just answer, well, it's detective fiction, but there is a lot of detective fiction that gets translated from Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, Icelandic, some from Finnish. And, people have a real hunger for thrillers. And so I can sort of understand that. But there is so much amazing literature that's published in Swedish, just like in any language. And I am sometimes a bit frustrated. I mean, as an example, there is a woman whose work I think is brilliant, a Swedish writer, and she's won awards in Sweden. And I worked with her agents, her Swedish agents, for years trying to contact publishers here to get her translated here. You know, I did sample translations and wrote to people, and they wrote to people. The response was always, she writes women's fiction. We have women's fiction in English. Always, yeah. I just saw Shanon's face, yeah. And it was so frustrating because I felt like they were saying, well, we know what a woman's story is. We don't need another woman's story. And, you know, really, would you say that about a novel written by and about men? Probably not. You know, you wouldn't get the same response. And so, you know, for me, that's been really frustrating. I mean, that's just one example, but also, you know, because we work in children's literature, Scandinavian children's lit is quite different from English language children's lit. You know, it's a lot more, open about many different topics. So, you know, you might find pornography in children's literature. You might find, you know, references to death, open discussion of death, sexuality, all sorts of things that we wouldn't necessarily see so often in English language literature, although it is changing. And that's been a similar situation where there have been a few things that I've really loved and tried to talk to publishers about, and they've just said, it's too shocking. It, you know, our readers are going to complain, their parents are going to complain, we just can't do it. And it's this real kind of underestimation of what readers are interested in and what they can handle, I suppose. And, you know, we were talking about the kind of who of translation, but it is this sort of why thing. It's publishers making these decisions based on what they think is best for their bottom line, and it's very limiting.
Yeah. It isn't often what we're talking about is things that we're talking about things that are quite arbitrary in one sense, that are presented as though they're kind of, you know, very firm lines. You know, the picture book is completely fine with bodies. The moment you like nipples not allowed. The moment instantly this picture somehow it breaks the rule, as though we had a kind of hard and fast rule about how things are kind of what is permitted in a book for this particular bit of the market or that other bit of the market. I mean, the other thing which I suppose one of the issues that we I don't know how we deal with this, but I will raise it just because it's a problem, I suppose, is that a lot of the imbalances in what gets translated, certainly into English, but I'm sure in lots of other languages, is a reflection not only of what Gitanjali was talking about, the kind of structures and things that exist within publishing that are reflecting something else, but also reflections of what's happening in the market or the sector or the literature in which out of which things are coming. So I work with Brazilian literature, as Gitanjali does, and there has been traditionally a huge imbalance in what we're translating from Brazil, but there's a huge imbalance in what's being published in Brazil in the first place, which feeds into who are the writers in Brazil who get recognized, who are the writers who make money, who are the writers who win prizes, and who are the writers who get funded. And I wonder, I mean, I presume, Janan, you have some view of this as someone who's working in multiple markets, to use that you know.
Well, first for me, it's always sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, for me it's always like in the beginning, like I said, I was always not impressed, but like, oh man, if publishers say this, they must be right. You know, when I was younger, you know, because I was trusting the system. And the more I grew up, the more I was like, oh, actually, the system is fucked up. You know, I shouldn't trust this system at all. And because they think of a market, many publishers think, and I don't want to say all publishers, because I also want to acknowledge a lot of independent publishers are doing the work. They're putting a lot of effort trying to find the writers who are less represented. They go talk to the right people in the different regions and countries. So some of them do the work, but they remain like niche and small, and they're not celebrated in the same way in the media, because the system only celebrates people who have good agents, good PR machines behind them, you know, a lot of money to do advertising so they can be everywhere all the time, and their books can be in the bookshops and sold. So this is all a system, economic system, that allows certain voices to be seen more than others, which makes the work of independent publishers very difficult, which makes the work of for us also very difficult. And I've seen this a lot with Turkey. Thankfully, it has been changing, throughout the years. We don't only look at Turkey for stories that are very Orientalistic. We try to move beyond that. And I've seen that change happening because there's been a lot of work done by translators, but also, independent agents as well, because sometimes you also have agents in certain countries that take all the space. They go to these book fairs, they talk to everybody, they manage to sell because they know how to pitch and how to sell. And the other agents who are really like passionate, they only have a very small list of authors who they want to defend, they have less chances because the others are like sharks. And that's also the reality everything happens in. And a recent example I can show from the Netherlands, and maybe people are going to hate me for giving this example, but there's currently a bestseller in the Netherlands, and I don't want to name this author because she really triggers me. Since February, it's been a bestseller, and it's a book that contains a lot of racist language, and it's clearly Islamophobic. But now because it has been a bestseller here, it has been received by the media abroad as a book that defends women's rights. So the whole narrative of the book has been changed into headlines, and you have articles in the New York Times, the front cover of Le Point, and of course this book, the rights have been sold to publishers across the world because it was marketed, a big bestseller, huge media attention, but nobody actually goes into the work and check what kind of work it is. So this system I would like to question. And this is what makes our work, especially if you're like me, an activist in translation. I really, really am quite political in the work I do. It gets sometimes emotionally very, you can see I'm more emotional now that I talk about this. It can be very tiring. It can be because we fight against very big things, which sometimes are impossible to break. These big media, it's impossible to break these barriers. And so I move back to the niche. I hide back in the independent things.
is the issue? I mean, I think we need to talk about capitalism, right? Can't live with it. That thing, can't make a living without it. Capitalism seems to be a very obvious part of this problem, and the extent to which we assume that somehow the most important way of validating or giving value to something is whether it can make money, whether we can make money from it, whether a thing is promotable, whether a thing is sellable. And you all at different points at the beginning of our conversation talked about how money is involved, how viable this profession is to make a living from, whether you have to have, BJ helpfully gave us the kind of proper job, scare quotes thing. And it's a subject I feel sort of torn about in a funny way, because on the one hand, I completely acknowledge this kind of problem with sort of having to play along with what does the market want or think it wants, what do people think the majority of consumers want, what is the product that is going to shift in the largest numbers. And so what Janan described of kind of moving away and doing the niche things and trying new things and working collectively, which we haven't talked much about, but all those things feel like a really healthy and positive response to that. But at the same time, there's a part of me which thinks I should be able to make a living from this, because I don't want this to be a job that you have to be able to afford to do it. And one of the issues I think we have in saying, well, I'm just going to disconnect from the commercial side of it, and I'm just going to I refuse to buy into that. I'm not going to play that game. I'm going to translate what I want, and I'm going to do it however I want to. That automatically has that kind of negative side of saying, in that case, it's only for people who can afford to do it as a hobby. The moment you extricate yourself from those rules, you immediately don't have the possibility of making this an economically kind of viable thing. And I don't know if anyone will please disagree with me about that, but I feel like there is a kind of there is a sort of tension between, you know, I have, I hope the same problems you do with the kind of capitalist valuing of what we value, but at the same time, I want to be able to pay my mortgage, and I would like to be able to pay my mortgage by being a translator.
Yeah, and not just pay mortgage. We also want to have a nice life. You know, just because we're translators and writers doesn't mean we need to have a bad way. You know, we also have nice things. We can have nice things too. So, but I agree with you. There is always a conflict. But for instance, that's why I earlier talked about other ways of using translation in our work. I managed to make a living as a freelancer. Of course, I don't only translate, but translation is part of everything I do. And I bring translation into other ways of working. You know, the way I program for a literary festival, I bring translation in there. I've created a whole workshop series to train translators for specifically to work with literary festivals, because we have differently. So I created a project called City in Translation, where I've been invited by universities to do residency, to give workshops. So yes, of course, it's not specifically sit down and translate, but translation is really part of everything I do. And I think then when we teach literary translation, we could open more these doors for people and say, okay, the way of thinking about literary translation, literature, how we move between languages, it's also something you can use working in this field. So we offer more possibilities, and we shouldn't minimize also the impact of other media like television and podcasting, because storytelling really happens on a very high level on these platforms as well. And there we also need good, you know, how many times you watch a Netflix series and you see a translation and you're like, oh my God, who did this? You know what? Why did they choose this? It's so obviously someone who doesn't understand what is happening here. So you're like, we need people like us to do this kind of work as well. So I understand what you're saying, but I think there are solutions for it.
Thank you. That's reassuring.
If I could just add something, I would just say that I kind of feel, well, I do feel very privileged to be translating. So unlike the two of you, and I'm not sure about Gitanjali, but I'm not trying to support myself full time as a translator. And I just kind of feel like I couldn't, because I mean, you know, maybe I'm exaggerating, but there are a few translators from the Scandinavian languages who do make a living that way, and they get asked to do most of the work. So I'm kind of in this strange situation where when I was starting out and I did want to support myself as a translator, I would just sort of take anything, and, you know, any job that was offered, any rate that they offered, you know, I just didn't know how to negotiate. And it was all very stressful. And it was, you know, I was trying to support myself while I was doing my PhD as a translator. And then gradually, you know, I got other work to support myself. And so now it does feel very privileged to me, because somebody will say to me, as somebody did a few weeks ago, could you translate 2 novels from Danish to English for £400? And also, could you do it in 2 months? And I was able to say, I'm sorry, that is totally unreasonable. I'm not taking that fee. And they said, okay, we'll find someone else. Okay, good luck to you. But if I'd been trying to support myself, I probably would have felt really pressured to take that work on. But also, the flip side of that is that occasionally somebody has approached me, and it's, you know, maybe the author paying for it themselves, or it's a small publisher, and they've said, look, we don't have that much money. Could you do it for a lower fee? And I have felt really engaged by the project, and I have said yes. And maybe that's not that's doing a disservice to my fellow translators. So yeah, I mean, capitalism, boo, but I don't know how to escape the system. I find it really stressful, actually, still.
I want to come back before we move to questions from the attendees. So just a reminder, if you're watching, to put questions in the Q&A box. I'll come back in a moment to what Canan was saying about the sort of the different things, the different ways she uses translation, whether programming and training people and so forth. And I'm going to ask each of you a bit about how you use translation in your work that is not translating, which may be teaching, it may be shadow hearers and a number of other things. But I wonder whether you could each say something about, in your work as translators, by which I mean when you're actually translating, working on a piece of text, making it into another piece of text for a publisher or for a podcast or whatever it may be, whatever you're translating. To what extent some of those questions we started with about diversity within the profession, diversity within what is being translated, and how those things are represented, to what extent you do or can have that as part of your, I suppose, as part of the choices you make. I think a lot of translators individually feel like we don't have very much power, but we do have the ability to make choices, and some when we are fortunate enough to. And this means deciding, especially if you're not dependent on this to make your living, deciding to accept this job and to reject that job, whether it's to do with your own taste, whether it's to do with your with ethical concerns, moral concerns. And I wonder whether you could each just say something about, I suppose, the choices you make as translators, as people who translate things, rather than that broader thing we'll talk about in a moment, and how they might reflect these kind of concerns we have about our roles in this profession, our responsibilities within the profession. I mean, Gitanjali, do you want to take a crack at this rather vague question first?
Yeah, I think that when I sort of came to like understand a bit more about literary translation, I felt like it wasn't just going to be the economic stress that was going to stress me out, but just the whole, I just felt like, you know, any entry into that industry was going to be me like kicking and screaming at all times. And so pushing for things, I just felt like it was a lot. And I think that with Shadow Heroes, I was really happy to find a space, or to create a space where I was able to work with people who shared we share, you know, similar ideas about what translation is, what it can be, who share similar concerns, who want to apply these concerns into their work and find ways to share that with young people in a way that also enables those young people to push through some of these lessons that we internalize in our school systems about what language is, what translation is, what languages are valuable, etc., etc., and use translation as a way to, I suppose, disrupt these hierarchies that, you know, end up you know, shaping how students construct, or young people construct, their identities and themselves. And so I think that, like, you know, for me, there is no translation without the concerns that we've been talking about, because this is how I see translation. I see it as a political process. I see it as something that teaches us about power. I see it as something about teaching us about representation, colonial history. And it's one that's primarily, you know, a creative process that also allows us to express ourselves, also think about like the ways that we're expressing ourselves. It allows us to engage with the world in a way that's also like self-reflective, in the way that, you know, these ideas about like mastering, or like mastering languages, or like acquiring literature, that all of these are like colonial, this, you know, mirrors colonial patterns. And I think that, like, for me, I just felt like, you know, working slightly like adjacent to the industry was a place that I could breathe, and I could work in a way that, and I think that, you know, as Janan was saying, that, you know, translation forms a part of everything I do. It has always, you know, in terms of both like my personal life and my like professional life. And so this is just a reflection of that. If I translate literature, if I have the like privilege of, you know, being able to like do some work, it's really satisfying thinking through these issues like on a kind of minutiae scale. But I just, it's something that I do think that it's very stressful. It's very stressful space.
I'm thinking about just in terms of your own, not just what you can bring to other people through Shadow Heroes, but in terms of your own translation. I'm thinking about, I'm not going to name them obviously, but a piece of work you did and we talked about in a workshop.
Yeah.
Writer, a writer whose work I think you liked in some senses, but found various kind of sort of racialist sort of tropes and kind of stereotypes in there. And it was really interesting to see you sort of talk through what opportunities there may be for you as someone who decides to translate this or not, what the challenges are, where the tensions are, just in the decision, not even, what strategies do I use if I decide to translate this book, but making that decision about whether I want to engage with this piece of writing.
Yeah, I translated a short story for a magazine, and then I really enjoyed it, and then decided that I would attempt to translate the whole collection. And so I was like, yeah, enjoying, got this story, and I thought, oh my god, this is so problematic. There was loads of, it was super racist and super ableist, and I just thought, wow, this is presented, it was a new experience for me. I just thought, wow, and this will be a conundrum very familiar to lots of people, but it's the question of what do I do now? And it was really interesting talking to people, talking through that issue with lots of people. And I think it's where I sit on it at the moment is the you have options. I think that foregrounding that, if that was definitely going to be published, and that's 100%, then foregrounding that in some sort of note, I think that there is something about not shying away or hiding from things that are problematic in the text, but also bringing them out and talking about them and discussing them and introducing that kind of critical approach to reading via translators forward or other,
rather than attempting to make it palatable somehow.
Exactly, or taking it out, or making the most of it, and not making the most of it, but bringing it out and talking about it. But then in this workshop that Danny refers to, there was also the suggestion that you go to the publisher and take out that story, and there's ways in which you can frame translation, and I suppose the way that the practice of literary translation as an activist process, and this would be one. But also I think that if I was going to think really carefully about it, and the amount that I'm actually translating in, and if you think about my whole lifespan, say I'm going to translate I don't know, I'm going to pluck out a number here, 3 books, whatever, it's probably not, but anyway, if better make those 3 books that I really want to do and that I'm really proud of, and that are really interesting. I'm not going to waste my time on this. So that's the other thing, what do I want to bring into the world if it's only going to be so little? That's the other thing. So these are the thoughts that kind of came through, and I suppose those are rooted in the discussions that we've been having.
I'm slightly concerned now at trying to second guess what an entire career is going to add up to, and I'm now thinking there are quite a few of the things I've translated I'm sort of hoping will not be mentioned in my obituary. I'm not massively keen on all of them being I will be remembered for this really mediocre. Anyway, I will also not name them. BJ, that question I asked Gitanjali a moment ago, I want to ask you the same thing about the choices you make about what you translate and don't, the ways in which the things we've been talking about actually inform your practice when you're translating.
So, I mean, as I said, now I'm in this privileged position of having to do another job. So I have been turning down a lot of things that I just feel I'm not the right translator for. I mean, for various reasons. Sometimes somebody's offering me, a piddly sum, and I'm just not going to accept it, or some other issue with the terms, or it's something in the text itself that I feel I can't relate to this, or there's something in here that I find offensive. And so, that has been happening. But in my previous years when I actually did have to accept the work that I was given because I needed to support myself with translation. There was a case where I was asked to translate something that I found, I don't quite know how to describe it, but sexist, but there was a sort of real kind of macho undertone that I found difficult to relate to and found kind of unpleasant. But I had to do this thing. I had to do this job. And I also, the people who had asked me, they had connections. So, it wasn't just the money, it was me thinking, what could this do for me? And, I went around and around, how am I going to deal with this? And I just couldn't find my way into this text. And eventually I found literally just one phrase in the entire thing that I was translating that I thought, I kind of like this phrase. And I just focused on this one phrase the whole time I was translating, thinking, okay, this guy's work, fine, I like this one phrase. I'm just going to go with the tone of this one phrase. So it was definitely not my best work as a translator. And they've asked other people to translate his work because he has had more translated to English, and that's fine with me. I was not the right person for him. But that was kind of my way around it, that I just had to find something. I didn't feel that I could change it because there was just so much about the text that was his tone, that was his style. But just making myself like it in some way so that I could do a half-assed job.
I suppose that the things we find to, I suppose everyone draws lines about things they're comfortable working with and not comfortable working with, and things they feel will enrich them in some way, financially or not, and things they feel will kind of bring something to readers, will do something of value. And I suppose what you were just referring to then, BJ, also underlines the discrepancy between. So I don't want to talk about my own work in this conversation too much, but most of my income comes from translating books. And one of the things that means is I need to do a certain number of books a year. And one of the things that means is they can't all be my favorite book. And I hope lines I won't cross, and there are things that I think are toxic, and I of course will not translate. I wouldn't want to be anywhere near them, and I wouldn't want to condone them or propagate them. But I also, because I have to get through however many thousand words a day, I will also have, I suppose, different axes along which I measure what are the things to which I will say yes. So it may be something that doesn't feel like my kind of thing, but it's not doing anybody any harm. I'm reasonably confident of that. And it's how I pay my rent in July and August. I wonder, BJ, just before I ask Janan the same last question, when we talk about the way in which the conversation we've been having engages with your practice, talking a little bit, just as you were, about the translating and what you choose to translate, and whether you do or don't. The other side of it is things like teaching and working with students. Gitanjali mentioned Shadow Heroes, Janan mentioned things like programming festivals and stuff. And I wonder how much of the kind of conversation we've been having today you're having with students, people are having with students, how much there is a conversation in seminars and classrooms or whatever about not just, how you become good at this job and how you pitch to publishers and all those useful things, but what the responsibilities are, what are the questions you'll be asking yourself, what are the ways in which your feelings about your identity and how that relates to maybe, as Janan was talking about, the culture she wants to represent and the things she's translating from Turkish and so forth. Is that a conversation that can happen now?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's really important. And it's something I do in all my classes, not just the translation ones, is talking about how you bring your whole self to your workplace or to the work that you're doing, and how, yes, we all have to make a living, but also thinking about your values and how they align with what you're doing and how you can feel accepted in a certain place. So, there are hard lines that we all have, and they're different ones. I distinctly remember having a conversation with some students where we were talking about our ethical boundaries when it came to translating. And there was one student who's going, you know what? If I was asked to translate Mein Kampf, I would translate Mein Kampf. I have no issue with that. And, I'm Jewish. And for me, I was going, I kind of have a problem with that. And he was going, hey, I want to make a living. And also I don't have a real issue because, people can decide what they want to believe about Mein Kampf. And, so he had this whole idea about, people might have scholarly apparatus with their reading my translation of Mein Kampf. And I was saying, well, not everybody has access to that. But we do have these kinds of conversations quite a lot because okay, we're in the rarefied atmosphere of the university, but they are all going out into the world or already in the world. And it's important for them to think about who they are and how much of themselves they want to bring to their work and what they feel they want to do or don't want to do. And so we've discussed not just specific works, but specific types of work. One of the students had been asked to subtitle a porn film, which surprised me because I was like, why do they need subtitles? I mean, surely that's not the point. You're not sitting there reading, what great dialogue. But anyway, sorry, slightly beside the point. And she was sitting there saying, should I take this? Should I not take it? And the class was really divided on it. And, it's a personal choice. And based on finances, but also based on your own feelings about things. And it's really important to think about.
And there are also, I think, I don't want to dwell on the Mein Kampf question too much, but I think there are, most of these things are maybe less obvious than they seem at first glance, because I think one could, and I'm speaking as, so we have a total of 1.5 Jews in this conversation, and I'm the half. And speaking as the half in this conversation, I feel like there is a counter argument to yours. I think the counter argument cannot be a flippant one. It can't be, well, nothing matters. You can translate anything. Anyone can make money, whatever. But I think there is an interesting conversation about how much, as Gitanjali was talking about that story, how much we say we don't pretend this doesn't exist, and we say here is this thing, and we give it in some context, and we explain why we have a problem with it, rather than sort of making them palatable in some other way. We're starting to accumulate lots of questions. Let me just go to John just quickly with that same question before we move on to things in the chat.
Well, for me, it's pretty simple. I do the same with everything I do, not just with translation. I have very specific values I stick to. And just like Gitanjali just said, it's political, for me, it's political. So of course, my choices are going to be based on what I believe in, and not only the work. I think the writer, the artist, the person who makes the work is also important for me. I don't separate work from the artist. I'm not one of those people. For me, it's like, if you're a pedophile, if you're a racist, if you're transphobe, I'm not going to translate your work, and I'm not going to give you a platform. That's for sure. And also, I also have issues with writers who give different discourses in different contexts. In the home country, they offer a different discourse, and then they translate it to sell better into the world, into world literature. I also have a problem with those. So I will never translate those kind of writers either, because I'm not interested in the discourse they create. Even if their novel is the most entertaining, beautiful, whatever, for me, it's uninteresting. I really, when I translate, I'm at the service of a discourse. I help creating discourse, and I'm not going to help create a discourse I don't believe in, that's for sure. Of course, there are cases where characters may say things that are racist because they are racist characters, because they are sexist characters, and it fits into the story. So that's different. And when it comes to, for me, what's also important is to translate people who really need the translation. Like, I've translated lots of poetry from imprisoned writers in Turkey, Kurdish poet who's imprisoned in Turkey more than 30 years, writing poetry in Turkish. If someone asks me, can you please translate these poems? I say yes immediately, because I believe in what this person stands for, and the poetry is beautiful, and I know I can contribute. So for me, it's also, again, it touches on activism. So it makes sense for me that I'm not going to translate someone whose discourse I don't believe in.
Thank you. It's so much more ethical than I am. It's very disappointing. I feel like I shouldn't have said any of the things I said about my own work now. Anything for anyone. We have some questions in the Q&A function. If you would like to add any questions, please do. I'm going to start working through these now. We have quite a few, and they're very interesting. So, Janan, yes? Can
I add quickly something? Because what I just said also links to the privilege of the choice. But I have created that privilege to have the choice by doing other kinds of works. that I wanted to add also.
Yeah, that's important. Thank you. There is a question from Jack McMartin, which is a good question, which is about money, which we've talked about a bit. It's a market question, and I'll summarize briefly. He says there's been much talk about the industry and the market, implicitly meaning upmarket established high prestige UK publishers of fiction and so forth. And the question is whether you have any experience with or aspirations to implementing alternative economic models or platforms for distributing translated content that might better serve readers looking for more diversity of various kinds in their reading diet. While also, and this is the kicker, providing a living wage for the producers of the translation. So I suppose the question is partly, are those two things mutually exclusive? Is it possible to remove yourself from the big economic structures and create something that nonetheless allows people to make some money? Jack mentioned things like crowdfunding, subscription models, multimedia platforms, and so forth. It's, as I think we know, this is true about writers, certainly in the English-speaking world. It has never been easier to get your work published. It's never been harder to make a living being published. And there are obviously implications for who has the opportunity to do that if you have to be making money from something else. Would anyone like to venture an answer to that? Alternative models for...
I guess it depends on the context, right? On the country, the local market, let's say. I work with a publisher in France, which started as a ebook publisher, and then they moved to print on demand. They're doing quite an okay work, but it's not a complete response because we don't have the same impact as the traditional publishers, but there is a small community behind it. And so I guess being niche actually helps sometimes. And for models, for instance, in the Netherlands and Belgium, we still rely a lot on public subsidies, public help. And that's always a pain also because these subsidies also ask you more and more to be entrepreneurial, especially in the Netherlands, which is quite neoliberal. So even the cultural subsidy system is very, always focusing on entrepreneurship. So yeah, I'm afraid I don't have good examples for this.
That point about where public money can play a role, I think is an important part of the answer, isn't it? Because you don't have to you don't have to create a system in which maths work differently. You just have to find money from somewhere else that enables you to offset costs in a slightly different way. And it's not surprising that when Janan was talking about the small independent publishers who are doing really interesting work, that certainly in the UK, almost none of them would exist were it not for the fact that they have Arts Council England funding, Creative Scotland funding, or whatever it may be. And that's the only way basically of offsetting what would otherwise be a massive kind of loss-making enterprise. Gitanjali or BJ, do you have any magic solutions to how we can make this make the numbers add up differently somehow?
I don't have any magic solution, sorry. And also, obviously, the UK leaving the EU has changed things because we don't have access to the same funding. So that's very problematic. But one thing I would say is that these kinds of stipends, such as from the Swedish Arts Council or other ones from different countries, they seem to be adding to my workload as a translator because, I get a publisher contacting me saying, oh, we'd love to translate this book. Could you write a report for us that we can use, to submit an application to the Swedish Arts Council? And also then could you, send the CV and could you do this? And it's more and more work for the same amount of pay to help them get the funding, which would then be used to pay me. And they're saying at the same time, we don't know if we're going to get the funding. So could you do this work on spec? And, again, I am doing it. Again, I feel like I sound like the biggest idiot on the panel because I'm like, oh yeah, I'll do stuff for really low fees. But, that's kind of the only way, as you say, some of these publishers can survive. But I have contributed to several other publishers, kind of crowdfunding enterprises, because I think that the work they're doing is really valuable. But I feel sad that we're kind of at that stage, so that's what has to be done.
I mean, one of the solutions. I mean, I think Jack in the question mentioned subscription models like Irene. And what a lot of them have, and other stories have been doing this for about 10 years, and a lot of other small independents in the UK have. The subscription model you pay whatever and you get 4 books a year or 8 books a year or whatever. One of the benefits of that from the publisher's point of view is in advance a certain number of sales, and your margins obviously are much healthier than if you're having to sell down the line and you don't know how many you're printing and so forth. It doesn't always mean the money ends up overflowing vast quantities. But there's a question from Fiona who mentioned, she says, I'm very interested in Gitanjali's reference to the possibility of writing a translator's forward to contextualize issues in a part of the text, to enable readers to approach the text with critical mindset. And I wonder, she says, how common it is for publishers to welcome such a forward. There's something, I'll just bundle these two together, but there's a question from Barbara Spicer about text produced by translators, whether it's diaries, notes, or afterwards, as well as translation theorists, which are somehow undervalued compared to the texts. I wonder, Gitanjali, maybe I'll start with you, since it referenced the comment you made, I don't know whether you know how common it is to have those sort of contextualizing things as a way of, I suppose, as a way of complicating, helpfully complicating people's reactions to the text. But whether that feels like a useful solution to some of the things we're talking about, that it's about how we frame the presentation of the things that we're publishing and translating, and indeed talking about in classrooms.
I can't comment on how common it is, but I definitely believe that it is. I think it's a great solution to a quite complex issue, which is that if we're specifically thinking about translating texts from cultures and languages that are minoritized in the UK, it's I'm actually just going to reference a conversation I had recently with Kavita Banot, who is a translator that I work with, and she was specifically talking about translating this Punjabi text, and within that there was, there was, the text was quite misogynistic. There was some problems with it. It was quite a problematic text in some ways. And she started talking about how, when we translate that into English, what does that mean? What does it mean to translate this into English when that context, the English context, is one where there are so many stereotypes about South Asians, and this would be sort of perpetuating those stereotypes and more. And so here we have a solution where the reader is encouraged to approach this text critically, but then there's another layer to it, which is that, when you're translating a text that's already sort of, when you're translating a text from a culture that's already sort of undervalued in some ways in sort of an English context, then what does it mean to bring that text in? So that it's a very complex issue, but I do think that is a good, it's a positive solution because it encourages critical reading. And I think that's actually the main thing, that, we all need to be reading more critically, both translations and the original source text.
It's like when you're describing that, it sounds like very much the same thing as is underpinning the workshops and Shadow Heroes, isn't it? This idea that it's not just about translating or not, being able to translate or not. It's about the conversation around the process and the conversation around the substance that allows you to do something which is much richer than simply, am I going to translate the story, and if so, which words am I going to choose? That there is a critical conversation which is not just extra, but which is essential to how we can do this piece of writing.
Yeah, definitely. So having those contexts as part of the having those conversations as part of the translation process, and really having them inform the translation process, I think is really, yeah, something that I feel quite passionately about. Yeah, so I think it's a good solution.
Thank you. There's a question from Imran Gachbais-Carvalho.
Well, wait, could I just add something, Danny?
Yeah.
Sorry. I was just going to say, from the translation studies point of view, so teaching, translation theory at the university, there's more and more research or writing about disruptive translation practices. So, highlighting these kinds of issues that we've been talking about, so racism or sexism or anti-Semitism or homophobia or whatever, in the work that you're translating. And to be fair, a lot of the research is quite theoretical. So people are suggesting, okay, if you want to highlight the gender, you choose particular words, or you add footnotes, or you can use symbols instead of letters. And, some of that works really well and is great, if you're doing maybe something for a literary magazine, but the issue is, will people generally accept it? So the average person going to a bookstore, are they going to want a book that's full of footnotes from the translator, or that uses symbols all over the place? And in some cases, yes, they will, but in other cases, it's a little bit more problematic. So I feel like we need more ways of highlighting some of these issues. So making these books available, but also showing or challenging some of the things that they feature in them. But that's just from the sort of translation studies side of things.
Oh, but also in practice, think about when we were talking earlier about what are the things that are getting translated from Swedish, the idea that one might begin a Swedish crime novel with a note from the translator that is not just about interesting challenges in translation, as it were, but ways in which there are problematic things in the text which I sought to mediate or not in the following way. There are certain bits of the market which will bear that discourse. There are certain bits of the market which I think publishers will assume could not. Janan.
I just want to add that the public is also very interested in the process, because when I do events, people really ask questions about the choices, but also how translation happens, and accept more and more that different people will translate differently. So I think there is an interest, and there are lots of interesting content. That's also, there's a wonderful film, Dreaming Murakami, which is about the Danish translator of Murakami, a beautiful documentary about her process, but it's so beautifully filmed, so beautifully made. It's an artwork in itself. So I think really when you propose these to the public, they are interested. Maybe not footnotes. I don't personally like use footnotes, but I think there are many ways to use other media, but also text, books, podcasts, whatever, and people will join in.
Potentially.
I've just lost my train of thought. What were we talking about just now? Sorry,
the public. We're saying the public is interested also, but I don't know if that's what you reacted to.
Come back.
It'll come back. Wait, give me a wave and I'll bring you back the strategic moment. There's a question. I was just going to get a question from Imran, who asks about one aspect. Oh,
I've just remembered.
Imran, I promise we will get you your question. This is my second failed attempt at asking you a question. Okay, there. Angelique, while you remember, tell us the thing you're going to say and I'll move on.
So I was going to say that whenever you write an ethnography, there is a big section of that where you reflect on your process of interpreting everything that you've studied. And I think that that's something that, I was just thinking about this ethnography that I read, and there was this whole section on, positionality, and, that I ended up critiquing, but I just suppose that's such an integral part of the ethnographic process, that you write that section, that you reflect on how you interpreted, why you interpreted. And I feel like that is something that is so central to the translation process, because ethnography is a form of translation, and also translation should move away from also ethnography, because it's not that, but that self-reflection and that part of like a translation, it's focusing on the creative elements is not enough, because that's not everything that translation is. And I feel often that exclusively focusing on just the creative elements of translation is another way of just like maintaining these structures and silencing any sort of opposition or challenge to power, I think. And so we should all start writing that section. That's what I was going to say.
I mean, I agree, and I love nothing more than writing those things. Though I think obviously one of the differences between an ethnographic report and the translation is not, as it were, the theory or the ideas behind it is the readership, and what we think, what we assume our reader wants, and whether or not we are prepared to pander to what they want, or whether we're fully intend to challenge what they think they want. I'm going to
imagine if we read that being like in translation, we'd be like, my presumed readership is, and that's why I have. That would, yeah.
Well, I have just written a translator's note for a book that's coming out in a few months. And one of the things I say in the translator's note is I have no idea who you are as the person reading this. And that's incredibly difficult if you're translating, as I was, from a language which has 300 million speakers around the world into English, which is basically, my readers could be anywhere. And actually trying to second guess is absolutely a mug's game, because the idea that I know somehow that my readers are all going to be in Lewis within 100 yards of me, creates more problems. The question we have from Imran is about relating to that thing, the question about who can translate what, and it's to do with genre. There is a sense that if you translate certain kinds of writers, certain genres, you have to be a writer, you have to be a poet. I mean, I think particularly with poetry, that sense, it still exists in some conversations. To translate poetry, you have to be a poet. There is possibly a part of this which relates to writing for children as well. I wonder, and so Imran asks, do you agree with this? And if not, how do we change this perception? Janan does not agree with this. She was shaking her head in real time, even as I was asking. How do we change people's perception of this idea that you need special magical powers to translate poetry, or to translate picture books, or to translate whatever?
I mean, to be a good, a translator, you have to be a reader. So for me, it will be more, if you're not reading lots of poetry, don't translate poetry. You don't have to write poetry to be able to translate poetry. What happened to me is that I started writing my own poetry because I translated so much poetry, and I realized that I have it in me. But it wasn't the other way around. In the beginning, I never identified as a poet at all. So, and I think I did a pretty good job with the translations I did. So, no, and I think this is very you exclude again by using these terms and saying you have to be a writer, you have to be this, you have to be that. And you can become one by doing, of course you have to know how to write if you want to translate, but that comes, I think, more from lots of reading and lots of curiosity.
BJ, do you find that when we're talking about working for children, then that part of it is because you're not someone who has written lots of, as it were, from scratch, written lots of books for children, but there are presumably particular skills, particular knacks, or whatever you may want to call it, techniques, strategies that you've developed from studying children's literature, from reading children's literature, from talking about children's literature, which gives you some kind of expertise that makes you better place to translate children's books than people who have not read it or thought about it before.
Well, I mean, first I'd just say that actually I've written loads for children, but I write for my own children, so I've not published anything. So I couldn't even tell you how many stories and poems and so and even a couple of novels for children, but it's for my kids. So I kind of have some practice that way. But yeah, I don't think I kind of want people to think you need special skills, because then maybe fewer people would go into it. But in some ways, we'd have less competition, which would be nice sometimes. But really, you don't need any special skills, except that curiosity. I mean, translation is about wanting to know, and I mean, translation is writing, and both are about wanting to know about this life, this character, this perspective. perspective. And so it's just being open to that. I mean, that being said, I do feel I have an advantage because I have children and I use my children. This is why I had my children, so that I could try out all my translations on them and, get their input. So, when people ask about the kind of ideal reader, in some sense, for me, it's my children because I want them to be entertained. But I don't think you do need that. I think you just need to have the curiosity and the sense of wonder, the desire to know.
Thank you. There's a question about the I'm sure everyone or most people watching will have heard about the story of the Amanda Gorman translation into Dutch, the Marika Lucas Reinfeld translation that wasn't that created a lot of discussion and a lot of controversy some months ago, which is something that I know, John, you've written about and talked about. The question which I want to focus on as part of this, which Fiona asks, has the discussion that's opened up been useful and productive? I think we've heard bits of this conversation, some of it adequate, some of it inadequate, I think, in this argument over the last few months. But I wonder whether you feel, what any of you feel about this, whether it's been useful and productive in some sense, and whether it is likely to open up fresh opportunities for translators from a wider variety of backgrounds. And I'll start with you, Janan, just because I know this is something about which you have been talking. I'd like to ask all three of you this question.
Well, I wrote about this, as many people know, and I invite you to read because I've said everything about it there. And what I've seen, it is making a change, because now finally the industry in the Netherlands, at least, has opened their eyes to people who are already there. So it's not like, oh, new people see a possibility to, it's really, everybody's already doing their work since decades about this topic. Finally, you have a white mainstream literary field that wakes up to this, thanks to this conversation. And let's remember that the Netherlands is a still very racist country, where systemic racism happens on so many levels, from employment to the housing to the cultural sector. It's everywhere. So it's in this context that the conversation really exploded. So let's not forget about that. It's very important. And now I see, that there's all these panel discussions happening, and lots of publishers are now actively looking via lots of people who work with a diverse pool of translators. They're looking for these people to say, okay, can you please suggest a translator for me? I'm looking for a translator for this author, etc. And this is positive. I'm not saying it's going to be solving everything, because there are still many barriers in the way the publishing sector works. They still are not sure. They think, oh, someone maybe doesn't have enough experience, it's their first book. And that's where we need the support. We need the mentorships. We need programs that help these translators to actually get, once they're in, also to make sure they do a good job as well, because of course quality also matters for everyone. So yes, I think things are moving.
Thank you. Gitanjali, what about you? Was it useful, do you think?
I didn't really engage too deeply, because I think generally I felt that it was a here in the UK, at least in my experience of it, was that it generated a sort of a conversation that was distracting from what the main conversation needed to happen. And I think that it generated almost more racism than it was, that the whole question, that rather than questioning. And so, yeah, I think that's all I'll say on that.
Thank you. That's a very useful additional conversation. BJ.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Janan is kind of the expert here, and we should all read her article if you haven't already. But I would say that I sort of have mixed feelings, because I worry that we're going to get into a situation where people are saying, well, you only can translate work where you have the exact same background. Of course, nobody ever has the same background. We're all individuals. And to be honest, I've never been asked to translate a work that relates to my own background. I'm right now translating something about a queer person, but I think that's actually the first time. And so, if I if somebody said to me every time I was asked to translate something, are you heterosexual? Because this features heterosexual people, that would be a problem because I wouldn't have any work. And yeah, so I worry about it going in that direction, but equally, it is hugely important to increase who is translating, what we're thinking about translation, and some of the stuff we were talking about before in terms of writing translators' notes, or the ethnographic approach, making people aware of the issues involved in translation, involved in the production of text generally. We need more awareness of that. So I think it was good on that front, but also problematic in different ways.
It's also problematic in the sense, sorry, Jen, I'll come to you in a second, but when Gitanjali was talking about the kind of distraction, one of the problems seemed to be that there was this kind of straw man thing about, does that mean that, only thousands of year old dead people, Greek people, are allowed to translate Homer? And actually, I don't think anyone was making that suggestion. And I think that was one of the more unhelpful parts of that conversation, that there was a huge amount of either genuine or performative anxiety about the thing which is not in fact the problem. And there are 27 different problems, but that in fact was never one of them, despite the fact that that seemed to be the thing that got their headlines, if you like. Janan.
Yeah, and that it's very good what you say, Vijay, because that's absolutely not the question, of course. And I work with a lot of Black writers and translators here in the Netherlands who also don't fight for that. It was very specific to Amanda Gorman's poetry in a context less than a year after Black Lives Matter in the Netherlands, where Blackface still exists. It's still a tradition in this country. So it's in this specific context, I would say, okay, hey, there's a problem in this industry. Let's change that. And it's, I think, our job to really make sure we don't fall into the extreme where, like you said, we're going to have to check boxes before we can translate any work. Of course, we can translate work by, I can translate work by men. What happens if they tell now, okay, only men can translate works by men? We're screwed because there are more women translators than men published. But so this is a danger. So we have to really nuance and create new discourses. We really need to make but it's, I think one example is good to always share. Maybe that's more, that will make less people angry, is Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey. All the choices she made when she translated the Odyssey, which now we see, oh yeah, actually it does matter who translate what and when. And yeah.
There is a, sorry, I'm just going to jump. I want to wrap up in just a moment, but there's something which I think relates to a few of what the things that you've all been talking about, which is it's in the chat rather than the Q&A. I'm trying to jump between different fora now, but utterly Malta talks about the thing that Gitanjali was talking about in terms of the thing Gitanjali was talking about is important in terms of the invisibility of the translator or lack thereof. So to the extent to which we are or not encouraged to offer our own commentary on what we are translating. And it feels like part of a lot of the different things we've talked about have been the extent to which translators are, their own opinions are valued, their own opinions are foregrounded, the extent to which translators are visible, their own choices are made visible. And I wonder whether quite a few of the things we've touched on may come back to that. It's about translators being empowered up to a point, visible up to a point, valued up to a point. Does that make sense? Someone say something, go on.
Yes, it makes sense, because I think the visibility of the translator and the processes is linked to all these questions about diversifying. Because the more we make it transparent, the more visible we are, the more the reader understands what's happening when we translate, then the more we're going to be able to diversify and stop asking for translators to work all in the same way and expect that there is one way to translate a work, and that our identities and everything around it, a way of looking at the world, does not matter when we translate. Change that perspective comes with visibility of the translator, and respect also for our field, and accepting that we will do things differently. And my dream, I'm going to tell it out loud, my dream is that one day people will start, you know, choosing books based on translators and say, oh, I want to read all the books translated by this translator because I trust their vision, I trust their values, I know what kind of books they like, you know, just like you would choose the work of publishers or curators, that translators have also that, you know, that they are empowered also to be able to be seen like that.
I feel like a lot of readers who are themselves translators do that. I mean, I follow the work of certain translators and I will read anything they do. And it's translators whose taste I trust and who I know are more discriminating than I am, frankly. And I know that, you know, everything they do will be something that somehow represents an aesthetic, an ethic, politics that I am sympathetic to, excited about, interested in, or whatever. But yes, there aren't. I don't think we translators read quite like everybody else.
Who are your favorite translators?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I was thinking about this the other day, funnily enough, because someone, Jenny Croft, who many of you will know, translator from Polish and Spanish, who is brilliant, and I will read anything she translates. She tweeted about translators being named on the covers of their books. And she said on Twitter, I'm not translating another book for a publisher who doesn't put my name on the cover. And one of the conversations that came out of that, it was a really interesting and valuable one, was rather than assuming that naming the translator in the front of the book is going to be a bad thing, it's going to just scare people. Why don't we think, you know, in some contexts, like if that translator is Jenny Croft, that might be a selling point rather than a kind of obstacle that we have to hide. And I certainly know, I mean, even the languages, I mean, I translate from Portuguese, Spanish, and French, and so I don't read a lot of translations from those languages. But even in those languages, I know that if something has been translated by Margaret Jill Costa, it'll tell me something about what that book is. If something has been translated by Sophie Hughes, it'll tell me something about what that book is, or Julia Sanchez. And they're not the same as each other, but I have some sense of what translated by Sophie Hughes, translated by Julia Sanchez, what that means if that's on the front of a book. Yes, anyway, my own reading habits aside. Janan, yes.
Can I address one of the questions, because an interesting one, a comment from Murat Can?
Yep.
He says that when we translate poetry or a song, we should know cultural differences and social values specific to a culture. It needs another motivation. It's an interesting question because, as we discussed in the beginning, it's about assumption of who our audience is. And I think who the reader is, who is in this market, who's going to buy this book and read it, or also for a song, it can be the same. But I always say that, again, it depends on which context we translate. In Western European context, there are lots of similarities, I think, because these are very mixed populations, because we have so much immigration and so many people with different cultures, history, you know, these post-colonial countries. So I think when it comes to, this is what we need to break, you know, this idea that there is one audience. And for instance, in the Netherlands, the literary sector always think that it's a, you know, white audience that will read. So we need to explain certain things differently to them, or make certain choices based on those. But it's not true. It's not true at all. It wasn't true in the past either. But now we start to finally accept it isn't. France is the same. So when I translate, I think more of people like me, you know, who are multilingual, multicultural, than the, you know, monocultural native, so-called native reader or receiver of the culture. So I hope I replied to Murat Can's question.
There's also what's inherent in that question is also an assumption that you're going to have a really deep familiarity with where the thing is coming from, with the culture it's coming from, not just a kind of shorthand for that and some secret point of access to the receiving culture. It's a different thing that is valued, isn't it? We have been talking for an hour and 3/4, and I feel I should probably allow you to stop talking. I'm very grateful to the three of you for contributing this fascinating conversation. There is There is a lot more we could have talked about, though not possibly today. So I'm going to take a deep breath now. Thank you to Vijay, to Janan, and to Gitanjali for this fascinating conversation. Thank you to everyone at the European School for inviting us to do this. There are a few links in the chat. I'm trying not to be distracted by what my fellow panelists are writing to each other in the chat, which you don't want to know. But there are links in the chat to various things, including to Janan's article, which we referenced earlier. That's it. Thank you, three of you, very much. It's lovely talking to you.
Thank you so much for chairing so brilliantly, Danny.
Yes, thank you, Danny. Thank you.
And it was so great to be part of this with Gitanjali and Janan and Danny.
Likewise.
Same thing.